Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What's the point of Congress investigation into the riot at the Capitol if the instigator-in-chief of that insurrection remains wildly popular with his followers? Let's get to the bottom line. The January 6th Commission says it wants to make sure that the events of January 6, 2021 never happen again. The Democrat-led panel has argued that former President Donald Trump was at the center of an election fraud conspiracy that ultimately led to an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. He still refuses to admit that he lost the 2020 election, and a lot of Americans still believe him. And judging by the latest opinion polls, they haven't changed their views on Trump, with most polls saying he would beat President Joe Biden if elections were held today. So where will the investigations go from here? And how true are Republican criticisms that it's just a Democratic Party attempt to gain political points? Joining me today is Democratic Congressman from Pennsylvania, Brendan Boyle. Congressman Boyle, I'm really grateful for you joining me here. And let me just start this with a very serious element here. You were in the Capitol when this attack on it happened. And as I understand it, this is the first attack on the U.S. Capitol infrastructure since the War of 1812. It just is not a normal thing. What was it like being in the midst of that melee?
You know, it's really hard to describe, and even now, I think many members who went through it, myself included, are still kind of processing what happened. It also happened so quickly. Even though it was the course of a day, things went downhill extremely quickly. So one of my vivid memories is literally with my staff pushing a couch in front of my office door, making sure all of the other doors were locked, barricading ourselves in. Certainly an unforgettable day and a very sad one, but I would also point out ultimately we did our duty. Went back to the House floor that evening. I spoke just after midnight because the only state that was still challenged disgracefully even after the riot were the electoral votes from Pennsylvania, and gave a floor speech that I'm very proud of, and ultimately about 3:30 in the morning certified the election and ensured that the transfer of power would take place 2 weeks later on January 20th.
Look, I don't want to run through all the points, and you and I have both been watching and listening to every word of these hearings. I know you have. I saw you do it in the last hearing. That said, when you think about what Liz Cheney, a Republican, we should note that there are two Republican members of this January 6th committee hearing, Congresswoman Liz Cheney and Congressman Adam Kinzinger. She said there was a 7-point plan that Donald Trump put into action to overturn the elections of 2020. And in that, I guess my question to you is, do you think President Trump ought to be in jail?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I believe there's already sufficient evidence to indict Donald Trump. I firmly believe that he will be indicted separately in Georgia. We know the grand jury is meeting right now. I mean, my goodness, he is on tape clearly intimidating the top election official in Georgia, literally saying, just find me the votes that I need in order to declare me the winner. The irony of all his schemes, of course, is that even if one state flipped, he still wouldn't be close to the actual number that he needed. He needed at least 3 states to flip. But, you know, for someone like Donald Trump, that sort of practical thinking wouldn't come into the picture. And my biggest fear, I wrote an op-ed in the spring of 2016 about Donald Trump in a Philadelphia newspaper. And I said Donald Trump is different than any previous Democrat or Republican or Whig who came before and sought the presidency. Because deep down, he is not a small d Democrat. He's obviously not a capital D Democrat, but he's not a small d Democrat. He does not believe in democracy. Think of all of the worldwide authoritarians he would speak about glowingly. He's quoted by one of his ex-staffers as coming back from North Korea, speaking admiringly about how afraid Kim Jong-un's staffers were around him. Trump spoke admiringly about that. So this was always one of my biggest concerns from the very beginning about Donald Trump. And even though until we reached the Trump presidency, I'm not the kind of person who ever would have been supportive of indicting a former president of the United States. We don't want to be a country where the successor is indicting the predecessor, especially for political reasons. This is different. If we do not hold Donald Trump criminally responsible for what he did, I believe the great danger is that it will happen again except next time it would succeed.
Look, I happen to know that you are good friends with some Republican members of the House. And when you talk to them privately, what sorts of gravitational forces take them to a different place than you? Or if you were a Republican, take your hat off for a moment, and you were a Republican, would you be able to make the same statement that you just made and politically survive?
Probably not. What is so impressive about what Liz Cheney and one of my very good friends in Congress, Adam Kinzinger,
you are good friends with Adam.
He and I co-lead a caucus on Syria together, and have worked very closely for a number of years now to attempt to change and improve U.S. policy as it relates to the Syrian war that's now going on more than a decade, and sadly has been forgotten by too many here. Adam is someone I like and I'm friends with and admire a great deal. And I think even though the commission or the committee is described as a Democratic-led committee, it is in terms of the numbers of the membership. That's, by the way, because Kevin McCarthy rejected putting GOP members on, other than the two that were appointed by Speaker Pelosi.
So I just want to emphasize for our audience so they get lost in the weeds. Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, had an opportunity to put other members, and they withdrew that opportunity.
Correct.
So there are two Republican members that are leading. I mean, one is the daughter of a former vice president of the United States, and rather a tough vice president of the United States. You know, the Cheney name is a known name in GOP circles. Why, in your estimation, just as, you know, in this mix, has she become so reviled? Adam Kinzinger, you know, is likely going to move on to, you know, run a new organization called Country First. But in that, the Republicans don't seem to be solvent right now in terms of this discussion.
Yeah, so let's be clear. The reason why there aren't, as we both described, Republicans on the committee is entirely their own doing and their leader, Kevin McCarthy's doing. But even with that, what has impressed me maybe the most about these committee hearings is that the overwhelming majority of the witnesses have been Republicans. Two of the people who have really, I think, had the biggest role, from what I've seen in the hearings, are the two Republican members, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. So for those who would describe it as partisan, I disagree with that. Overwhelmingly, the biggest impact of these hearings has been from Republican members of Congress and Republican witnesses, most of whom were staffers of Donald Trump. I think that is what gives them such credibility.
Now, I don't know how the legality got sorted out, if you could actually impeach a president who was no longer in office, right? But if that decision had been made, which I think is in dispute, if you could impeach President Trump again for the newfound evidence about his, you know, involvement, the pre-knowledge they had of what an armed mob was going to do, and his own desire to lead that mob up the steps of the Congress, do you believe he would be impeached today?
So first, I did vote for impeachment exactly 1 week after January 6th, January 13th. He was impeached in the House, one charge. I believe every Democratic member voted for it, and 10 Republicans voted for it. And then 57 senators voted to convict him, including 7 Republican members. That was actually the most members of the United States Senate to convict a president of their own party in history. Previous to that, there has just been one.
Wow.
So I do think that speaks volumes. Now, I don't know about this. I don't think you can actually impeach someone on the same charge twice. It would have to be a separate count, I would assume. But given the evidence that is there now, if this had all come out last January, February, whenever the trial was in the Senate, I think it was about 6 weeks later, I do wonder if you would get the additional 10 Republican senators. But that brings us back to the original question that you asked, which is, can a Republican member of Congress survive and be viable standing up to Trump? It is obviously very difficult. There are many privately who want to do what Adam Kinzinger is doing, want to do what Liz Cheney are doing, but frankly just don't have the courage to do so.
What has been most surprising to you about the January 6th hearings? What has come up that you were surprised by that you didn't know, even though you're a member of Congress and a friend of Adam Kinzinger? Is there anything that's been really moving for you?
The fact that the Secret Service already noticed that there were individuals with weapons in the crowd and relayed that to Donald Trump. That's very important legally. That's consciousness of guilt. So then when he told them to go to the Capitol, we now know, because of these hearings, he knew that they were armed, that there were individuals in that crowd
And he
who were armed.
reportedly said he wasn't worried because he knew they weren't after him.
Correct.
He
Correct.
didn't mind if they were after someone
Correct.
else.
Yeah.
Which
So-
is remarkable.
So how do you not indict someone after this, given all of that body of evidence?
Well, I think, one of the other interesting questions that comes up in this is, President Trump's positioning with this about the election and election denial in this. And we do have a comment where he basically said, we know that he, was reported to have said in a taping that he didn't want to say that the election was over. He admitted that Congress had certified the votes, but was unwilling to say, hey, we're not going to do that. And then also, if you read this January 6th committee interview, which we have here, he X'd out in his own hands that he wanted to hold those people who broke the law accountable. He basically took out, this section, I'm directing the Department of Justice to ensure all lawbreakers are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We must send a clear message, not with mercy, but with justice. Legal consequences must be swift and firm. He X'd all of that out. Why did he X that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. He feels that what he cares about are people who are with him or people who are against him. That's the only thing he cares about. It's the only thing he's ever cared about. And so he called them special people, if you remember, the day before in the video he filmed from the White House. He has spoken since then that if he were to become president again, he would pardon them. When I talk about the need to hold Donald Trump criminally responsible, it's not just for January 6, 2021. It's about January 6, 2025, and the January 6 that will follow every 4 years. Because if he's not held criminally responsible, there is every indication he will do this again.
Will his successor do it? If he's not elected, I think one of the really interesting questions as the world looks at our political mess in this country, is Donald Trump the cause of what we're seeing, the leader of what we're seeing? Is he a manifestation of a deeper dysfunction in America? There are other candidates out there, Governor DeSantis of Florida and others that are potentially interested in running. Even Mike Pence, who is vice president. Will any candidate who comes up on the GOP side be able to be different in behavior and direction and respect the rules and norms of our institutions? Or do you suspect that any Republican that is elected in this next election will bring in the same storm?
Yeah, so this is an open question in my own mind, and I go back and forth on this. The danger with what Donald Trump has done and that he's succeeded within the Republican Party is that the playbook has now been written. And so it's easy for copycats to come along and you see Ron DeSantis has even suddenly adopted the same hand gestures that Donald Trump used. I served with Ron DeSantis in Congress. He wasn't like that. He was actually quite quiet. But, he now gets to play mini Trump on TV. And so that is a real concern of mine, that now that Trump has opened the door to this sort of creeping authoritarianism in our system, that others would walk through it. I want to make one other point, too. As you know, I'm a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And all throughout the Trump years, I would constantly get the question from fellow parliamentarians of mine, who serve other NATO countries.
I should note you just helped to vote to support Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and you were a big leader of that.
That's right, and something I feel very strongly about and excited about Finland and Sweden joining our alliance. We will go to 32 members. It's one more way in which Putin's strategy is spectacularly backfired. But I raise this because at those NATO meetings, I would have British parliamentarians, French, Germans, come up to me and say, what is going on in America? Is democracy going to survive? These are questions people would never even think to ask before the last several years.
Well, we have polls. I just want to bring up some polls. When you kind of look at the question of whether Joe Biden could win tomorrow, and you see that at poll after poll, there is we've got 44.5% for Trump and 42.5% for Biden in a real clear politics poll. But if you look at a lot of polls, you see that right now. Now, I know that polls, and I should say this, you got to be careful of polls in the aggregate. What matters is electoral college and a lot of other dimensions that come in, as these votes are skewed around the country. But it's remarkable because I remember the days, Congressman, when someone with the baggage that a President Trump might have, given what we now know and saw, would be looked at as an opportunity for the challenger.
Yeah.
And I don't. So I guess I have two questions: is why do you feel that the Republican and national support for Donald Trump right now is so high? And two, what is the implication for your own party not being able to compete with that? What is the Democratic Party getting wrong?
Well, a couple things. First, I think it's quite clear that Donald Trump would actually be the weakest Republican candidate of the different ones that they could nominate. Just look at from where I sit in suburban or in Philadelphia, but the suburbs around me in suburban Philadelphia, you had Republicans win for Congress, like right above me, the congressional district, won by double digits, one for state Senate, one for state rep, and then that same district voted for Joe Biden by 6 points. So actually, Trump was the weakest Republican of the Republicans who ran statewide. Trump actually did the worst as compared to Republicans running for different the three other statewide offices. So in my view, Trump is toxic in the suburbs that are needed to win a general election. That said, though, in this highly partisan era in which things are closely divided in America, I think pretty much I would not dismiss the ability of pretty much any Republican candidate or any Democratic candidate to win a general election. Things are just that close. And as you know, there are probably about less than half the number of swing voters today that there were a generation ago. So now, in terms of what Democrats can do, we're still a long way to 2024. I really want to focus on 2022. The congressional elections are coming this fall. The historic pattern is that midterm elections tend to be challenging for the party in power.
Which means you guys are going to have a tough time. The Democrats are going to have a tough time.
Yeah, but I would point out, do not assume that if we have a challenging 2022, that will still be the case by 2024. There are many examples: Bill Clinton's midterm election,
right,
Barack Obama's midterm election, Ronald Reagan's midterm election. There are so many examples, actually, of a president in his first midterm election, his party losing seats, and then turning around 2 years later and winning re-election, in fact, winning re-election handily.
Do you think the Biden White House and the Biden leadership in the Democratic Party right now is at the octane level and the performance level it should be? You know, are they on their game?
Well, I believe the answer obviously is yes, but we can always do better. I also think that, and again, I speak to fellow parliamentarians who serve in their national legislatures around the world. It's so similar to what they're having to deal with because of this inflation crisis. I mean, the hangover from COVID, which was one of the greatest disruptions that has ever confronted society and one of the biggest disruptions that certainly we face in our lifetime, that is still having an impact. You walk in downtowns and offices that are half open, half empty because the workers aren't back. You can see it in my city of Philadelphia as well. The increase in crime in a lot of cities that has happened in the last few years, reversing what had been not that long ago, 40, 50-year lows, record lows in the amount of violent crime. So this is still all having an impact. And then, of course, probably most crucially, the inflation crisis, which, again, every country on earth is facing. Here in the U.S., 8 to 9%. There are other countries in Europe where it's double that. It's not a coincidence that right now you see pretty much every incumbent party in Western democracies struggling that's in government. And that is because of the overall mood being impacted by COVID and then inflation.
Well, I think you raise an interesting point because a lot of the Republicans that I know are raising inflation, crime, and immigration as the big three issues to run their campaigns on. And I'm wondering why the Democrats aren't meeting them in kind. You've got Joe Manchin, Senator Joe Manchin, saying, hey, we need to care about it, at least show some concern about inflation. We need to not pour $1 trillion more on a hot economy, according to him, in this view, or be careful about how we scrub what the government spends, on climate and other issues. And you seem to have this train wreck between people very committed on a key global concern, which is climate change, which we see the real world effects right now, versus near-term effects on people's lives and whether they can keep up, given with inflation and they're falling more and more behind. How does that get resolved? I mean, you're great at this in talking to your constituents, and I know because I see it in Pennsylvania when you're having that conversation with the public about these contending dichotomies, if you will. I don't hear it from the White House.
So what I would say is that the best thing we can do to address inflation is not have an abstract argument about how spending will affect things 7 years from now.
Right.
Let's bring it back to the basics, kitchen table economics. Prescription drug prices are too high. If we just do one thing, give Medicare the ability to negotiate prescription drug prices, we will save the government a lot of money, and we will save consumers a lot of money. Even those who aren't on Medicare will benefit naturally by the fact that prescription drug prices are coming down. That's just one very simple thing we can do. We already passed it in the House. Joe Manchin said he's supportive. Let's do it in this next week. That is something that would have a dramatic effect. And so, when I'm back home and speaking at town halls or running into constituents at the grocery store, it tends to be less about abstract arguments and more about very simple meat and potatoes type things. And so I think the more as Democrats we talk about that, the better. And also it keeps us away from other arguments where, frankly, Republicans probably have an advantage on us.
Well, let me ask you real quickly, and I'm going to be blunt about this, and hopefully you can give me a short answer. Jonathan Swan of Axios has done a remarkable set of reports around what would happen if Donald Trump were reelected. And that they would use a tool called Schedule F. It's a little boring, folks, but they would use this boring tool to essentially gut the expertise and drop thousands of civil servants who've been in government, drop them out, and bring in true believers in Donald Trump into whatever these positions are. And I'm just interested in what government that sounds like to you from our historic past. I mean, it's just smelling like 1930s Germany to me, and I'm just wondering whether it does to you.
That Jonathan Swan article is one of the most frightening things that I've ever read. We're talking about 40 to 50,000 federal government workers that are not political appointees, that are there because of a certain technical expertise. The idea that they would all suddenly be fired and replaced with people, again, who just meet one criteria, political loyalty to Donald Trump. That is part and parcel of what we were discussing earlier about him. He's an incredibly dangerous person. He never should have been allowed within 100 yards of the Oval Office, and he absolutely cannot be allowed in there again.
Let me ask you finally, if Liz Cheney were to run for President of the United States, would you be supportive of her efforts?
Well, I would love to see her as the Republican nominee. Look, there need to be two, at least, healthy, functioning parties for democracy to thrive. And I just want to see a Democratic nominee, certainly, and a Republican nominee that will keep our commitment to the transfer of power and democratic norms. Liz Cheney, I think, is a true profile in courage.
Well, Congressman Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania, thank you so much for joining us. I would hope you'll come back. This was a great conversation. Come back again. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? I imagine people all over the world taking one look at today's America and just scratching their heads. How can so many Americans want Donald Trump back, especially since he still hasn't admitted to losing the last time? Well, if you want to understand this society or any society, it's about living with crazy contradictions. Folks are worried about climate change, but they also love their gas-guzzling cars. A lot of people are hurting financially these days, but some are doing great. Some people believe that America is making progress with more fairness and rights for everyone, while others see their national identity being torn apart. It's all happening in the same country, in the same family, but as usual, it's a big dysfunctional family. Trumpism is here to stay, regardless of the investigation into his actions after he lost the 2020 election. Even if it's not led by Donald Trump, there will always be a politician out there ready to jump on people's grievances and take them to a new level of skepticism and revved up despair. And that's the bottom line.